All right, welcome back. We are covering the section called Abolition on your study guide, although it's about more than just abolition, as we'll find out here. But it's kind of where we're headed towards. All right, so let me get the sharing up. Get the right window up. There we go. All right. In and around the War of 1812, the U.S. had a second Great Awakening. Now, we skipped the first Great Awakening. That one took place back in the 1730s. But the second Great Awakening, which is a religious movement among Christians, in this case, Methodists and Baptists. And one of the big sort of characteristics is the camp meeting, the emotional preacher, the emotional reaction. These big meetings would take place for like a week, and they were social gatherings as much as they were religious meetings. There would be, quilting and sports and stuff like that. Those of you who have ever been to church camp have a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about here. This led to a couple of changes in the dominant Christian thought. Um, Dominant Christian thought had been predestination. Now, I don't want to get too deep into this because predestination can be sliced into several different varieties. I'm not an expert on all of them, so I'll keep it simple. But basically, your eternal reward or punishment was already decided before God even made the earth. This is what the Puritans had believed, and this had been the dominant thought during the First Great Awakening. Again, you can slice this up into a lot of different varieties. You're more than welcome to read about them. If you want to write to me about them, sure, I'll read it. But that was pretty much the dominant thought. What the Second Great Awakening brought is sort of a decision theology that you decided your eternity by either accepting or rejecting Jesus. By accepting that you were a sinner, by accepting that you needed the forgiveness from God through Jesus, the atonement of Jesus, the sacrifice for man's sins, et cetera, et cetera. So this kind of changed the flavor of American Christianity. Now, predestination still exists. There are people who are still predestination adherents. I think John Piper is one of them. That's the only one that comes to mind. Some of you may know that name, some of you may not. But decision theology, if you've ever been in church, and they have that, if you want to accept Jesus into your heart, come on down to the front kind of thing. That's what we're talking about here. Okay, so that's the reaction a lot of these people are having. As they are clearly sort of, this guy's over here crying about his sins. These people are weeping about their sins and they're accepting Jesus. That's kind of what's going on here. This led to a belief called perfectionism, that just as you could accept or reject Jesus, you could choose whether or not to sin. And that a Christian, through prayer, through rigorous denial, could eventually become sinless. And I have met people who are trying to do this. There are still people out there trying. That's all I'm going to say. Now, most Christians coming out of the Second Great Awakening did not attempt this, the perfectionism, right? But what they did sort of embrace was the idea of, as much as possible, perfecting society, making society better. And so what we're going to see here is a lot of what we would call social reform, particularly in the northern states. Oh, I can't type today. Particularly in the northern states, we are going to see a lot of social reform. So things like, not only dealing with the effect, but dealing with the cause. Like, why do people become alcoholics? How can we prevent that? Why do people become drug addicts? Why do people gamble? Why do women become prostitutes? Why do men go to prostitutes? Why do these things happen, right? Prostitution, gambling, alcoholism, drug addiction, which was something that existed at this time, all of those things. Like, how do we prevent people from doing those things? Right? So we'll see a lot of education reform. We'll see a lot of prison reform. Like, when people are in prison, can we teach them how to become useful members of society so they don't go back to committing crimes? And so you'll see, like, maybe if these prisoners had some sort of skill, so let's teach these prisoners how to be carpenters, let's teach them how to be blacksmiths, let's teach them how to be leather workers, those type of things. Mental illness, how we treat the mentally ill, or at least how we try to treat them. Before, mentally ill people were basically just chained up, and you could actually tour in a mental institution for like 25 cents. And all they did was just chain them up to the wall. So how do we treat that? Is there a way to make them better? Now, clearly, these people in the 19th century are not going to know anything about brain chemistry, all the things we've learned about mental illness, but at least they're going to try, okay, and help as much as they can. So it's about the causes. And how do we prevent people from becoming mentally ill in the first place? Is there a way we can do that? So in the North, it's a very wide-ranging issues, and it's going to go deep, cause and effect. In the South, it's mainly going to be treating the effects, not the causes. And the reason for that is very simple: slavery. Southerners, if they are going to look at the causes of problems in the South, in terms of alcoholism or gambling or dueling or any of those things, they're going to have to take a look at slavery. What effect does slavery have on slave owners? Right? Why do so many slave children look like their owners' white children? Well, because a lot of times they have the same daddy. So, yeah, rape. power of life and death. That's going to involve having to take a long, hard look at slavery, and that's just not going to happen for the most part. There will be some slave owners who will free their slaves. Their experience here will be so powerful that they will free their slaves, but that's pretty rare. So Northern society, lots of stuff. Southern society, not so much. There are also, and these are kind of my favorite group of people, and you only find them in the North, the utopists. These were people who would withdraw from society to isolated enclaves or communes, as we would call them today, and experiment with new social rules, new what sociology is called mores. Okay? Some of them are religiously motivated, some of them are not religiously motivated, but there are vast numbers of them. The religious ones, well, like the non-religious one, if you want to dig deeper, is Harmony Farms. This was in Indiana, and it basically there was no private property. It was sort of a commune that existed there at Harmony Farms. There was also no religion at Harmony Farms, and there was no marriage at Harmony Farms. So it was kind of like a big free love. No, I'm trying to think of a modern example. The only one that keeps coming up is the Manson family. Um, and that's not fair because these were not Manson people. There actually is something similar to Harmony Farms today in Tennessee called the Farm, and you can look that up. And they started very much the way Harmony Farms did. They've evolved a little bit, but they're the only thing I can think of in today's society that is close to Harmony Farms. The religious ones were also a lot of fun. They would typically try to reform Christianity. They felt that Christianity had sort of gotten away from the truth. One of these was the Shakers, mainly found in upstate New York, Pennsylvania kind of area. The Shakers were celibate. They did not believe in sex. And so even married Shakers were required to not, do that. And if you go to a Shaker settlement, you'll notice like there are separate doors. Like in the church, there's a door for the men and a door for the women. And the dining room, there's a door for men and a door for women. And so everything is designed to be separate. There are two Shakers left in the United States. And if you'll give me a second, I will look up because there was a fascinating article about him recently. Let me pop out here. This article, I think from the Smithsonian, I think is the one. Yes, there are two Shakers left in the entire world. It's not just in America, but in the entire world. Whoops, that was supposed to be a link. You can go there. It's probably easier just to give you their name. Shoot. Sorry, I'm reading the article. It's in Maine. Here we go. Brother Arnold. See if I can find that article. Yeah. If you look, I forget this link, but just look for, let me get the rest of his name here. Had H-A-D. He is one of two Shakers left here in America. But at one time, there were a lot of Shakers because they took in orphans. You have to remember in the 19th century, there was no child protective services, there was nothing. The only people who watched after orphans or people who were maybe too sick or too injured to work anymore were religious groups. And so the Shakers really did not peak until the early 20th century. And they've sort of dwindled since then. These two are the only two left. They're not accepting any new members. Brother Arnold and I forgot the lady's name. June Carpenter. They are the only ones left. And when they go, because they're not taking any other members, that'll be it. Religious tradition, a couple hundred years old. Oops. Trying to find my way back. Here we are. Will be gone. Kind of sad. But they're one of the groups. They believe that they have been brought about. Their founder is a woman named Ann Lee, that they have been brought about to reform Christianity. And another group which not only survived but continues to thrive in the United States and in fact around the world is also a utopist group, the Latter-day Saints. The Latter-day Saints, I'm going to move this down a little, started out, as one of these religious utopian groups. Here's their founder, Joseph Smith. But again, they followed the pattern of Reformed Christianity. They will withdraw from society, go to isolated spots, and experiment with other ways of living. And in their beliefs that Christianity had gone bad, basically, they drifted away. And so Smith believed he was to restore true Christianity to the world. Now, there are two things that really helped the Latter-day Saints survive where other religious groups did not. One was the frontier. As we'll find out here in a few moments, whenever things got a little too dangerous, you could pack up and move a little bit further away. The second was their own scripture. Everybody else was simply arguing about how to interpret the Bible, but the Latter-day Saints also had a second Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon tells a lot of stuff, but the central message is that Jesus, after the resurrection and the ascension, those of you who are familiar with, the Book of Acts, where Jesus ascends back up into the heavens, that Jesus went to Mexico to preach to the natives. Now, where is this coming from? There was a theory in the 19th century that Native Americans might be descended from the lost Jewish tribes. You're saying, what lost Jewish tribes? Oh boy. All right. We go all the way back into the Old Testament. Right? We have 12 Jewish tribes, right? Because Abraham had 12 sons. Okay. Remember that song, Father Abraham had many sons, and I am one. There were 12 sons, and those 12 sons became the nation of Israel. And after the death of King Solomon, Israel split into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom was conquered and vanished from history. And there were 10 tribes. 10 of the tribes made up the northern kingdom, and they vanished. These disappeared from history after they were conquered. So that left only the two southern tribes. Whose names I have forgotten. I know one is Benjamin. I think the other is Judah. But I am open to being wrong about that. Now, we now know that these northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, were simply assimilated into the people that conquered them, those who survived. But there was a theory that Native Americans might be descended from those lost Jewish tribes. It was even something Thomas Jefferson thought might be true. And in fact, when Lewis and Clark, going back to the beginning of this unit, when Lewis and Clark, before they went on the discovery, Lewis had visited a synagogue and met with a rabbi to learn about Jewish rituals from the Old Testament so that he could keep an eye out in case he saw any sort of version of that maybe had been passed down over the last, whatever, 3,000 years. That was something Jefferson asked him to do because there were a lot of people who thought this might be true, this descendant from the lost Jewish tribes. What got the Mormons into trouble, the Latter-day Saints, was polygamy. Polygamy, which is the belief that a man can have multiple wives, got the Saints into trouble in Missouri, which is where they first settled, until they were chased out of Missouri, literally with whatever they were wearing. Like the governor of Missouri said, you can kill Mormons and you will not be prosecuted. That's how much the Mormons were hated in Missouri. So polygamy got them in trouble. They split from Missouri and wound up in a spot called Nauvoo, which is in Illinois, which was kind of on the frontier. And in Nauvoo, they did pretty well for themselves. People don't build fences unless they're planning to stay. People don't add a second story to their houses unless they're planning to stay. People don't build a giant ass temple unless they're planning to stay. So they're doing quite well for themselves. It looks like they plan on staying here, having built all of this stuff. And then the polygamy issue came up again. Smith also led a mob to a neighboring town to destroy the newspaper, which had printed article about his troubled youth. He had been convicted of trying to con people back when he was a teenager. Um, that's true. That really happened. The church now acknowledges that yes, this did indeed happen. Um, for a long time, they denied it, but court records, the original court records, all that stuff has been discovered. So Smith went to the town, destroyed the newspaper article. He was arrested, and while he was in jail, he was killed in a gun battle. And so at that point, the remainder of the LDS, under the leadership of Brigham Young, split. Again, the frontier is always something that LDS can retreat to when things get too overwhelming. This was in about 1844, so they split west to a land they called Deseret, which we today call Utah. And there are parts of Utah, I know Utah looks like a desert, much of it, and much of it is desert, but there are parts of Utah where if you properly irrigate, it will bloom. Eastern Washington State is the same way. There are parts of Eastern Washington State that look like West Texas, but if you pump in the irrigation for the crops, things will grow there. And a geologist explained this to me. It had to do with the last ice age, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into it. You can look that up yourself. So they went out there. Now, Utah at this point, or Deseret, was still part of Mexico. But Mexico was kind of having some problems. And so they really didn't do much to try to regulate or interfere. But in 1848, Utah became part of the U.S. And so this led to further conflicts. It led to some anti-Mormon propaganda, as we can see here, this anti-Mormon propaganda, how women and girls are ensnared. And there was kind of a low-level guerrilla warfare between the people in Utah and other Americans who were just passing through Utah to get to California, until finally in about 1857, the president told the Mormons to knock it off, or he would send the army out there. So at that point, they straightened up and flew right, although they won't get to join the United States until they give up polygamy, and that will happen much further down the line. All of these social events, all of these social movements we're talking about, all the religious utopias groups, all of the non-religious utopias groups, all of them are going to get buried by the struggle over abolition and slavery. That will become the defining issue of the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and then, of course, the Civil War. So a lot of these, like the education reform and the school reform and the mental health and alcoholism, those things will still be there, but they'll kind of not get as much attention as abolition, but they'll spring up again after the Civil War is over, after Reconstruction. And that's something you'll hear about in 1302. Now, to revisit abolition, in 1787, 5 states had already outlawed slavery, mainly the New England states. And there were other states who were sort of in the process of studying the issue. But slavery crept into the compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise. Slavery also played a role in the Missouri Compromise. So it's always there. Questions of abolition, the questions of slavery. Now, most abolition that happened before the War of 1812 was very regional or state. There wasn't really a national abolition group until 1815, what is called the American Colonization Society. They're the first group of abolitionists who, again, have sort of a wide American audience. Their goals were simple: the gradual emancipation, emancipation, which was already being done in a number of states where slavery was kind of being phased out. You might say, from this point forward, children born to slaves are not slaves. And then, 5 years later, this group of slaves is no longer slaves. And then 5 years later, these slaves are no longer slaves. So it's sort of a gradual emancipation. The colonization part, all blacks should be sent out of the U.S. So they don't like slavery, so that's good, but they don't want black people hanging around in the U.S., which not good. So it's a very racist organization. Again, half of their program makes sense, the emancipation part. But I mean, you're going to send people back to Africa whose ancestors left like 300 years ago. That would be like sending me back to the Netherlands. I don't speak the language. I don't have any of those wooden shoes that the Dutch wear. See how ridiculous that would be. So they're sort of the first group, but Great Awakening comes along, Second Great Awakening, and it provides sort of a religious impulse. And what begins to happen is that people begin to see slavery as a sin. And it needs to become something that gets removed from society, the way that alcoholism or gambling or prostitution, all those other things that they were attempting to sort of remove from society. Slavery now falls into that category. There are two prominent abolitionists in this period. One is this gentleman, William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison had been a member of the American Colonization Society, but had rejected its message, and becomes one of the leading, not only abolitionists, but rejecting the idea of colonization. He will be the founder of The Liberator. This is an anti-slavery newspaper that will begin publishing in 1831. Its goal is the elimination of slavery, period. It is a militant attitude, but it is nonviolent. We're not going to get to the violent abolitionists for a while when we get to John Brown and people like that. He'll only have about 3,000 people who actually pay for his newspaper. He never made a profit off of it. But his articles we reprinted in larger newspapers. If you still read the newspaper, like if you get the Austin American Statesman, you will often see it will say reprinted from the New York Times or reprinted from the Washington Post. So that article was written by the Times or by the Post, and it's simply being republished by the Statesman. And so that's kind of what happened here with Garrison, right? So his articles have a much wider audience than just his subscription base. The other, Frederick Douglass. Douglass had escaped from slavery twice. Somewhere along the way, he had learned to read and write. He escaped. He went on the speaking tour. Some of you may have heard of what I called the Chautauquas, which was sort of a lecture circuit people would go on. He published his autobiography, Up from Slavery. He eventually had his own newspaper. He eventually purchased his own freedom because he was an escaped slave. He knew there was always danger of him being arrested and re-enslaved. So he negotiated with his last owner how much it would cost. It was about $600 for him to be completely safe. What he offers, right, which nobody else brings to the table at this point, is firsthand testimony about being a slave. William Lloyd Garrison was a powerful advocate for abolition, but he was still a white man who had never been enslaved in his entire life. Douglass had grown up in slavery. He'd been born in slavery. He had no idea who his father was, although he suspected it was his first owner, that he had been the product of rape or sexual assault, at the very least. Yeah, rape. So he knew what that was like. He knew what it was like to be sold away from your family. He knew what it was like for families to be broken up. So he brings that firsthand testimony to it. In 1833, Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is still the nation's oldest anti-slavery society because slavery still exists in the United States. Every now and then the FBI will find out about it and break it up, but it also advocates for slavery because slavery is still practiced around the world, particularly sexual slavery or trafficking, as it's called. So it still exists. It's still doing good work. Their goals were immediate emancipation. They reject colonization. This idea that we're going to send the slaves back to Africa, no. And they are nonviolent. And we haven't gotten to the violent abolitionists like John Brown just yet. Because they're nonviolent, they're going to have to change people's minds about slavery, change hearts and minds. And they'll do this with a tool that was called moral suasion. That Garrison sort of came up with. It's not a particularly complex tool, but let's see. Let's just go to the new slide. Okay, that's better. All right. So moral suasion abolitionist, pro-slavery. So this is just about debating, like very simple debating technique. So if you find an argument for slavery, actually I'm going to switch these back around. More sense. So if you have an argument for slavery based on biology, well, you would come up with a counter argument against slavery based in biology. If someone made an argument based on scripture, you would make an anti-slavery argument based on scripture. And I have examples. Here's a book called Slavery Ordained of God, published 1857, The Christian Doctrine of Slavery. But God against slavery, freedom and duty of the pulpit to rebuke it as a sin against God, the guilt of slavery, crime of slavery, demonstrated from the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, 1860. So even quack things like phrenology, which is a quack science, you would come up with something from phrenology. And again, the list is endless. You could go on and on and on. If you came up with something from history, you would backtrack and say, there's an argument against history. So it's a way, again, of cutting off the arguments that are made for slavery by arguing, again, from the same field, but against slavery. Let me give you an example of a historical argument for slavery. Mudsill theory. This comes from a guy named James Hammond, who is a real piece of shit. Hammond, and he kept a diary of this, which I don't understand, but basically sexually assaulted all four of his nieces. I don't think, well, I don't know if there was any actual penetration, but definitely assault. He did rape a slave that he owned who was 18 years old. That slave had a baby. Now, hold on. He did not rape a baby. However, when that baby was 12 years old, he began to rape her. So again, real piece of shit. His argument is based in history. Okay? He argued that society is like a mudsill. Now, mudsill is an archaic word that has gone out of style, but the current word would be a flower box. Okay? Or if you do any gardening, you have sort of the, because at least where I'm at, I've only got like an inch of soil before it all turns to rock. So you might have those gardening boxes where you build the box and then you put a bunch of soil in it and then you plant whatever you're planting. In order, so that's his metaphor for society. In order for society to flower with things like literature, art, music, Nintendo, okay, whatever you consider society's flowers to be, there has to be someone in the dirt doing all the hard work, which leads to having slaves. And again, his argument for this was based in history. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans. And that's the mudsill theory. Now, if I were to make an argument against that, I would say these types of slavery were not the same as American slavery. If you can go back to our discussion all the way back in Unit 1 about slavery, these were circumstantial slaves, not lifetime slaves. So that's an example. Of a historical argument and a historical counter argument. That's kind of the way the whole thing goes. And again, this is an argument of the American Anti-Slavery Society. This stuff scared the South. The South was very, very worried about the increase in abolition. And so, like newspapers, like let's say you lived in the South, but you subscribed to northern newspapers because maybe you had business interests and you needed to know like what the stock market was doing or what the trends were for cotton or are there any new inventions. So you subscribe to newspapers, but the newspapers are being, before they come to your house, the mailman is opening the newspaper and cutting out all the anti-slavery stuff. They're also reading people's mail. So the South, again, was already paranoid. And then adding to their paranoia was Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831. Nat Turner was a slave who could read, and he might have been able to write. There is debate about that. Reading and writing are sometimes exclusive. Just because you can read does not follow that you can write as well. So that's still debated. But his favorite book of the Bible, and he was also a preacher, was Exodus. And Exodus is about the liberation of slaves from Egypt. And he became inspired by that. Now, two things happened in the year 1831. In February, there was, just a second, the solar eclipse. And those of you in sort of the central Texas area, you remember the eclipse we had, I think it was earlier this year, 2025, where the moon passed in front of the sun and it was like dark and everything, and that was pretty cool. Turner took that as a sign. And then in August, Turner said he saw another sign when the sky turned red in the middle of the day over Virginia. Now, it turned red in a lot of places. Turner's not the only person who saw it. This quote is coming from a newspaper in Philadelphia. The western heavens seemed as one vast sea of crimson, lit by some invisible agent. Thousands of Philadelphia citizens stood in the street and gazed at the skies, some with wonder, some with admiration, and others fearful that it was a sign of evil. Turner took that as a sign, and on the 22nd, killed his owner's family, okay, including the children. The rebellion lasted until the 29th, but most of it had failed by the 24th. It's hard to get numbers, 60 slaves, maybe 80, maybe 90 participated About 60 white people were killed, including a whole schoolhouse full of children, um, and their school mistress, their school teacher. But it was pretty quickly put down. But Turner wasn't found when the rebellion was finally crushed and crushed brutally, executions, etc. In fact, Turner wasn't found until October 30th. He had been hiding out back on the farm he begun the rebellion on. When he was found, he had copies of William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, in his pockets. And so the South's paranoia really kicked into overdrive. A few minutes ago, I talked about how they started cutting up newspapers and reading people's mail. A lot of that comes from Nat Turner being found with copies of The Liberator. Turner is executed on November 5th. He did live long enough to give his story. You can read this. He did talk to a reporter. It's called The Confessions of Nat Turner. You can find it online easily. Now, how much of it was edited, how much of it is a direct transcript, nobody knows. But that's why we know about the effect that the solar eclipse had, the effect that the blood red sky had, because he survived. But yeah, the South got really paranoid. Several states made it illegal in the South to teach slaves to read because of Nat Turner. So yeah, it really ramped up the paranoia of Southerners and of slave rebellions. A couple of other things to wrap up. Let's talk about abolition. One new argument. I talked about the various arguments that were made for and against slavery. The new argument about the 1840s was called planet paternalism. And the abolitionists never quite found a way to get at this one. The idea here is that slaves were too childlike to survive on their own. And thus, the planter, the owner, was a father to his slaves, protecting them from the outside world. I see I misspelled the word slaves here. Let me fix that real quick. And in some cases, the father was the real father to the slaves. Okay, we already kind of covered that. But yeah, it became this argument. And again, the abolitionists were never quite able to get one off against this, that yeah, the slaves were children. They were dependent upon their father, which is where the paternalism, father figure. So that became a new thing. Another thing that happened is what it did to the political parties. Because the political parties really had to change and sort of respond to this. We have two political parties. We have the Democrats and we have the Whigs. And neither one of them really wanted to take a stand on slavery one way or the other, and will avoid doing so until forced to by the abolitionists. Now, when that happens, the Democrats will move to protect slavery for a couple of reasons. One, so they can keep winning elections. If you're going to capture the southern states during a presidential election, you're going to have to become increasingly pro-slavery. But there was also the fear of the American system. Now, the American system had never entirely gone away. The bank had gone away. Remember, there are three parts to the American system: the bank, internal transportation improvements, and the third one I am forgetting, the tariffs. That's right, the tariffs. And so the tariffs had never completely gone away. The internal improvements had never gone away, really. And so there was still a fear of the American system, which the Democrats did not like the American system, primarily because if the American system continued to grow in power, that would mean a more powerful federal government, which might start trying to dismantle slavery or stop it from spreading. And so the Democrats would prefer to keep the American system at bay. The Whigs are very much in favor of the American system, even though the Whigs are not a particularly strong party. They do have pretty good numbers in Congress. And so the Democrats, they want to keep the American system out of the South. They want to keep the American system from gaining power. The way to do that is to win elections. The way to do that is to protect slavery. So the Democratic Party will become more and more pro openly slavery. What that does is that creates a number of third parties. The Whig Party doesn't quite come out as an abolitionist party because the Whig Party would also like to try to win some elections. So they're never really going to be an anti-slavery party. What we will get, though, are third parties. We can get a party like the Liberty Party, 1840 and 1844, the Free Soil Party, 1848, 1852. And these parties will push against slavery, or at least the expansion of slavery. If we can't stop slavery, we can't destroy slavery where it exists, let's at least stop slavery from going any further. And these parties, what they're going to do is they are going to push slavery into the center of American political debate. Slavery, I don't want to run this metaphor too hard, but slavery will be, by the 1850s, it will be like the issue of abortion today, about the legality of it, about whether or not it should spread, whether or not it should be legal. Slavery, same thing. These parties will push slavery into the center of American political debate. And then finally, the third political party, the Republican Party, which will first come about in 1856 and of course will eventually replace the Whig Party and win in 1860. That's a story for Unit 4. All right, so that is the end of the abolition lecture. As always, if you have questions, you can always email me or set up an appointment. I will see you in the Manifest Destiny video, which is a pretty short one, and in the North and South. And then that will wrap it up for Unit 3. And let's save this. No. And I will, if I ever find the right place, there I am. I will see you in the next video and have a good day.